In 1954, in the small town of Paraibuna, in the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil, 35-year-old metalworker Antonio Rossi went for a walk along the bank in search of the perfect spot to go fishing while his friends were setting up camp for the night. Antonio then came upon two figures that were humanoid in appearance that sent a shiver down his spine, and he became extremely frightened and tense. The beings were about 7 feet tall, and their skin was smooth and hairless. They were not wearing any clothes, and they appeared to have no trace of sexual organs. Although they had muscles, it was not like those of an athlete, and their hands and feet had only 2 long digits. His first instinct was to run, but something stopped him. As he looked at one of the beings, it moved its thick lips, which Antonio interpreted as a smile, and instead of feeling threatened, he felt an unusual calmness. Their eyes were large and almond-shaped, which dominated their oval faces. Their pupils were an intense yellow, and there were no eyebrows. Their nose was tiny and flat, and their ears were small and pressed against their head, and were slightly larger than a human's, and they had a serene look about them. In an effort to break the silence, he summoned up his courage and asked, "What do you want?" They did not immediately reply, but instead of responding verbally, it slowly raised an arm and pointed to its own eyes. It was at that exact moment that Antonio Rossi's world would change forever, where a clear and distinct voice came into his mind. It said, "We come in peace. We are inhabitants of another planet." The voice was calm and sad. "We have come to invite you to visit our world. We are not demanding, only inviting. If you accept, it must be of your own free will." Within a few hours we will arrive there, and they would bring him back unharmed, and he would be free to report everything he saw. Against all that his fear was telling him, he decided to accept. The being started to guide him, while just a few yards away and floating about 1.5 feet off the ground and totally quiet was their machine. It was a grey disc, about 100 feet in diameter and 30 feet high, with a central dome on top. A door then slid open, whereupon a ramp descended. Antonio Rossi was taking his first step into the great unknown. Once inside the craft, he found the interior was as impressive as the exterior. He was standing in a circular room about 26 feet in diameter, with smooth walls and a domed ceiling. Although the room was lit up, there were no bulbs, wiring, or any source as to where the light was coming from. Keep in mind that Antonio was coming from a 1954 perspective of the world. Everything from the floor to the walls looked as if it had been carved from a single sheet of material. In the centre was a circular table surrounded by small stools fixed to the floor, and on one of the walls was a 10-foot-long panel with buttons, levers, and in the middle was a large oval screen. He could see other beings, identical to those who had met him, moving around in silence. Then one of them handed him a cup containing a thick golden liquid that looked like honey. They explained to him telepathically that it was preparing him for the long journey. He drank the liquid, which was tasteless. The door of the craft closed, leaving the wall of a single continuous surface. The liftoff was incredibly smooth, with no vibration or engine noise, and no sensation of acceleration. The only way he could tell they were moving was when he looked at the oval screen, showing the Earth as a blue and white ball against the black velvet of space. With amazing clarity, he observed the city of Sao Paulo. He was now leaving everything he knew. He was no longer afraid, but was instead replaced by a sense of wonder. As the craft was making its approach, he saw the planet of his host through the window, and could see an oval-shaped city that shimmered as if it was made entirely of glass or crystal. The landing was as smooth as the takeoff. As he disembarked, he observed what appeared to be a committee who were awaiting his arrival. The beings looked like the others, except for subtle differences, where some had features that appeared more feminine and others were small like children. They were waving and smiling and came towards him and wanted to touch him, out of curiosity no doubt. Everything was extremely quiet, and there was no traffic noise or the sound of voices. The streets were like glass tubes, and the houses were round, transparent, and at an equal distance from one another, and were surrounded by gardens of brightly coloured flowers of the kind he had never seen before. There were no windows because the structure was translucent. Through the tubular streets he could see roundish-looking vehicles that glided fast and silent. There were no wheels or drivers, and everything looked to be a fully automated transport system, and to cross from one side of the road to the other they used small floating platforms. The city was illuminated like the spaceship, where light came from everywhere and yet nowhere. He later learned that jets of gases called photons were released at a high altitude, igniting and creating a cool light that bathed the entire city and the homes. He could see a world of harmony, light, and silence. He was led to a being who telepathically introduced himself as Zazie, the equivalent of a doctor. He spoke about the complexity of their civilization, where private property did not exist, and the vehicles called Voltoras were all collective. The ship that brought him to their planet was capable of reaching speeds our physics would consider impossible. In their world there was no money, and everyone had what they needed. Services were free, and the collective well-being was the main goal. Their diet was based exclusively on plant matter. Reproduction took place through the germinative kiss, a prolonged kiss that brought about gestation in an internal pouch in the female. Birth occurred through a small incision. They had no lungs, and respiration occurred through the skin from the atmosphere. They had spirituality with large rounded temples without walls with domed ceilings that were supported by columns that served as meeting places where projective images taught about mutual well-being. Death to them was not an end but a transition, where life was eternal, where beings travelled through different planets and realities in continuous stages of evolution. Zazie said that despite being pacifists, they possessed a formidable defense technology where high-frequency light ray emitters had the power to disintegrate a planet like Earth in a matter of minutes. He was emphatic that the weapons would never be used for destruction, but a last resort for defense. He wanted Antonio to write about his visit and promised that in the future he could visit other inhabited worlds with even more different beings. After his visit came to an end, and in order to return to Earth, he again drank the thick liquid before bidding an emotional farewell. He landed at the same location on the riverbank where the ship abruptly vanished. Still in shock, he walked until he found his companions, who were worried but relieved to see him. They asked where he'd spent the night, but there were no words to describe his experience, so he lied and told them he'd found a great fishing spot and had spent the night there. He kept this secret for 8 days until he could no longer keep it to himself. Of course, his friends were totally skeptic and said he'd dreamt it or had made it up. As requested by the alien being Zazie, Antonio Rossi did write a book titled A Flying Saucer, I Visited Another Planet, where he wrote in detail about his journey. Many years later, in 2007, now an old man, he gave an interview where his story never changed. But one of the things that stood out most was the crushing silence of the universe.